Good afternoon. Damon Borg from Navis Clinical Laboratories. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the lab, and I have a message today about xylazine testing. Many of you have heard the term xylazine, especially in combination with drugs of abuse on the street. As you can see from the slide here, some pretty shocking facts the DEA has recently published about them. So, quote, xylazine is making the deadliest drug threat our country has ever faced, fentanyl, even deadlier. And the DEA has seized xylazine and fentanyl mixtures in 48 of 50 states. And then some statistics about the detection rate in pills and powders that are seized. Xylazine is an adulterant that we're finding in seized samples of fentanyl. And when used in combination with fentanyl, the effects are much greater than with fentanyl alone. And as a result, many individuals are overdosing due to this combination. Now, a little bit about xylazine. On the street, the drug is known as tranq. It's a central nervous system depressant. It produces a relaxed state of euphoria, very similar to the effects that would be noted following alcohol or benzodiazepine use. Xylazine isn't necessarily a new drug of abuse. Some of the first reports of xylazine being abused were in the early 2000s. However, that was xylazine that was being abused alone. As I'll show in a moment, xylazine is actually a veterinary medication, and individuals were obtaining it from those types of clinics and abusing it directly. It's much different than the scenario we see nowadays. Today, xylazine is entering the US drug supply as an adulterant, and it's known as tranq dope. So what's happening is illicit fentanyl, illicit heroin are being cut and laced with xylazine to boost its performance. Now, why it's being used to boost is not entirely clear, but it likely has to do with the very cheap nature of xylazine, very cheap to manufacture, and because it has depressant activity, it boosts the effect of fentanyl. So individuals that are selling these drugs on the street are selling a product which is stronger than fentanyl alone. A little bit about the pharmacology. As I mentioned, xylazine is an FDA-approved veterinary tranquilizer. It's used primarily for dogs and horses to anesthetize them before surgical operations or as a pain reliever. It was investigated for human use. It was both investigated as an antihypertensive agent, but also as an analgesic or a sleep aid, a hypnotic. But in both cases, clinical trials were halted. The hypotension, so the reduction in blood pressure, was too significant, so trials were stopped. And as well with the CNS depressant effects, they were too great, and it was too powerful an analgesic or hypnotic. So it was canceled in those regards as well. So it's not an approved human medication. Some of the signs of outward toxicity are very, very similar to our traditional opioids. So respiratory and central nervous system depression, hypotension, bradycardia. So it is going to produce that depressant effect, and when used in excess, would reduce respiratory rates, potentially reduce CNS activity to a level that unconsciousness will be developing, and then potentially even if farther, respiration would stop and an individual would die. And what we find is that when used in combination with other opioids like fentanyl or heroin, there's a synergistic effect. What we mean by that is 1 + 1 = 5. So they work together to enhance the effect. Ultimately, what this means is an individual that is exposed or accustomed to being exposed to a known amount of fentanyl, if they're now exposed to that same physical amount of drug, but it's both fentanyl and xylazine together, the pharmacologic effects will be magnified, and you could easily find an individual overdosing on that combination. Another important and poorly understood side effect is the development of skin ulcers. So there appears to be an effect of xylazine on the vasculature, so the blood supply to the tissues at the injection site, leading to damage of those vessels, leading to a necrosis of the tissue, which requires, in some cases, hospitalization or further treatment above and beyond a drug abuse issue. In terms of the risks, as I mentioned a moment ago, many users are unaware that they're even exposed to xylazine. when they're obtaining drugs on the street, they are obtaining a pill or a powder. They don't have the ability to know exactly what's in that pill or powder. And there's, in many cases, xylazine in combination with the fentanyl or heroin. As I mentioned as well, greater potency of that combination and overdose risks are significant. In terms of the regional nature of this drug, we are finding higher rates of detection of xylazine in the northeast of the United States and the southern United States. And we are starting to see it crop up in the Midwest and West. However, it is lagging slightly. The statistics I've shown in this slide are from 2021. We're awaiting the data from 2022. However, we know from our own testing that rates are much higher this year than they were in past years. And then lastly, in terms of the overdose scenario, recommendations for individuals that have overdosed on a combination of fentanyl and xylazine is still to use the opioid antagonist naloxone. So naloxone is the rescue medication that will reverse the effects of opioids. Now, it will not have an effect on xylazine, but it will block the effect of any opioids that are present. And hopefully that would be enough to resuscitate an individual. I will note, however, that the percentage of xylazine in seized material is also variable. And there is the potential for material to contain an excess of xylazine, produce an unconscious state in an individual, and the naloxone being unable to reverse those effects, simply due to the fact that it's primarily xylazine producing the CNS depression, not necessarily the fentanyl or the other opioid. So, hope this was informative. If you have questions about xylazine testing, I'd ask that you contact our client services department or your sales rep for more information. Navis Clinical Laboratories has testing options available, and we can explain those to you in more detail if you contact us. Thank you so much for your time.